My name is Ellen Whitfield. I'm 52 years old, and for 26 years I have kept other people's books straight for a living. I balance ledgers for small businesses up and down the Cape Fear River. A hardware store, 2 restaurants, a marina, and, until 3 weeks ago, my own mother's bridal alteration shop. I want you to remember that I'm an accountant before I tell you anything else, because everything happened in my mother's front parlor. On the day of the will reading, only makes sense if you understand that I am the kind of person who reads the fine print. I read it for a living. I read it out of habit. And on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting in a lawyer's office that smelled like old carpet and coffee left too long on a burner, that habit was the only thing standing between my family and getting away with something they had been planning for longer than I wanted to admit. Before I tell you what was inside the box, I need you to sit with the sound of my sister laughing, because that laugh is the whole reason I'm telling you this story at all. "A sewing box," Danielle said, and she laughed. The way you laugh at a joke that's landed exactly the way you hoped it would. Mom left Ellen a sewing box. I want to be honest about the state I was in that day, because if I dress it up you won't believe the rest. I was not devastated. I was not devastated. I was not surprised. Grief for my mother had already come and mostly gone in the 18 months since her diagnosis. In 100 quiet installments. Driving her to chemo, sitting with her, while she slept in a recliner. A recliner with the television on mute. Watching a woman who used to run a business with a needle and a measuring tape lose the strength to hold a coffee cup steady. By the time the funeral came, I had already cried most of what I had. What I felt in that lawyer's office was something colder and more familiar. I felt the particular stillness of watching a thing happen exactly the way you always suspected it would, and being unable to stop it, because stopping it would mean admitting out loud that you saw it coming. Here is what my mother's will actually said. In the plain language Grace Doyle read to us that afternoon in her calm courtroom voice. The house on Water Street. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a converted sunroom that had been a working bridal alteration shop since 1974. Adam went to my sister Danielle, along with what the will called all business assets, inventory and goodwill associated with Rose & Co. Alterations. To me, it left, and I am quoting the will now, because the wording mattered more than anyone in that room understood at the time. My mother Rose's cedar sewing box and its contents, in the hope that Ellen will understand why. Danielle didn't wait for the lawyer to finish before she reacted. She's 48. 2 years younger than that description would suggest. Because our mother always treated her like the baby of the family. Even after she had 2 kids of her own and a husband who hadn't held a steady job in 3 years. She looked at me across that conference table with an expression I'd been on the receiving end of my whole life. Not cruelty exactly, more like an athlete's satisfaction at winning a race she never once considered close. "Well," she said, and reached over to pat my hand like she was consoling a child who'd lost a stuffed animal. "At least you get something sentimental. Our father wasn't there. He died when I was 4. A heart attack in Stan's back room. A heart attack in the shop's back room while he was helping Mom count receipts on a Sunday night, which is a detail that matters later, so hold on to it. Kyle, Danielle's husband, sat beside her in a golf polo that cost more than the funeral flowers, scrolling his phone through most of the reading, looking up only when Grace Doyle said the word house. I want to tell you what I did in that room, because It's the truest picture of who I'd become in 26 years of watching my family manage me instead of talk to me. I didn't argue. I didn't ask a single question. I picked up the cedar box from the corner of the conference table where the paralegal had set it, thanked Grace Doyle for her time, and drove home to my condo on the south side of town, with the box on the passenger seat, seatbelt fastened around it, the way you'd buckle in something breakable. Danielle texted me before I even got out of the parking lot. Kyle and I are going to have the appraiser out to the house Thursday. Just so you know the timeline. No question mark. My sister has never once asked me a question when she'd already decided the answer. I want to back up now. Because if I only tell you about the box, you'll think this story is about a piece of furniture. It isn't. It's about a shop that kept 3 families fed for 50 years, a debt nobody in my family wanted to remember I was owed. And a version of my mother that I only got to meet after she was already gone, Rose & Co. Alterations started with my grandmother Rose, who came to Wilmington in 1961, with a Singer sewing machine and $11. And built, over the next 20 a bridal alteration business that eventually supplied fittings for 4 dress boutiques up and down the coast. When she died, my mother, Peggy, took it over. And by the time I was old enough to understand what the business actually was, it had become the thing that defined our house. The smell of the place was steam and starch and the particular ozone smell of an overworked iron. The sound of it was the machine running late into the night during wedding season, my mother hunched over a bodice at 11 o'clock, fama for robbers, my father. All of them while my father did the books at the kitchen table because back then it was my father who kept the numbers. Before that job eventually fell to me. Here's the part of the story my family has spent years telling wrong. And I'm going to correct it now with numbers. Because numbers are the one language in my family nobody has ever been able to argue with. In 2009, Rose & Co. nearly went under. This is not family legend. I have the bank statements. The shop had 2 default years running, a slow economy, a competitor boutique opening 2 miles away, with an in-house alterations department that undercut my mother's prices by 40%, and a lease renewal on the sunroom addition that came with a balloon payment my mother hadn't budgeted for. By September of that year, Rose & Co. was 11 weeks from closing. My mother called me, not Danielle, me, because I was the one with a savings account and a job that had taught me exactly how bad the numbers were. I want you to understand what I did, because it is the center of everything that came after. I was 29 years old. I had $85,000 saved from 6 years of an accounting job I hated, and a marriage that hadn't happened yet to a man named David, who, I'll get to. I gave my mother that money, not as a gift, as a loan, structured properly, with a promissory note, drafted by an actual real estate attorney. My mother knew from church, a man named Harold Ness, since retired, since deceased, which matters later too. The note specified repayment terms. And, critically, it specified that in lieu of full cash repayment within 5 years, I would hold a 35% equity interest in the business. And, if the loan was not otherwise satisfied, a recorded lien against the water, street property, equal to that percentage to be released only upon repayment or upon my written consent. I remember signing that document at my mother's kitchen table. I remember her crying and telling me she'd pay every dollar back within 2 years, and I remember believing her. Because at 29, I still believed the version of my mother who cried at that table meant it. What I did not know, what I would not learn for 16 years, was that the lien Harold Ness prepared was never actually filed with the county register of deeds. My mother told me it had been recorded. I trusted her, the way you trust someone who raised you, and I filed my copy of the promissory note in a drawer and went back to my life. And the shop survived. And over the following years, my mother repaid perhaps $11,000 of the 85 in scattered amounts. Maya's annually. Before the payments simply stopped and nobody in my family ever spoke of the debt again. You have to understand what happened to that money in the family's memory, because it's the exact machine I want to describe to you. And if you've lived in a family like mine, you already know its shape. The $85,000 that kept the shop alive to Yive became, with a few years, a story about how hard Mom worked to save her own business. My name disappeared from it entirely. I heard my mother tell a cousin at a 4th of July cookout, not 2 years after I signed that note, how she'd scraped and saved and refused to let Rose's legacy die. And I sat there with a paper plate of potato salad and said nothing, because saying something would have made me the kind of daughter who brings up money at a cookout, and in my family, that's a worse sin than actually taking the money. Meanwhile, Danielle's relationship to the shop looked entirely different. And I want to be fair about this, because fairness matters more to me than making my sister into a cartoon. Danielle worked in the shop through most of her 20s, part-time, between jobs that never quite stuck. And there is a real sense in which she earned a claim to it that I never did, because I moved away for work and she stayed. She learned to do a hem the way our grandmother taught it. She knew every regular client by name. When our mother's hands started shaking too badly to trust with delicate lace, it was Danielle who quietly took over the most difficult work, and she never once complained about it, and I want you to hold both of those things at the same time, the way I've had to. My sister genuinely loved that shop. My sister also genuinely believed, by the time our mother got sick, that the shop and everything attached to it belonged to her by right, and that whatever I had put into it years earlier was ancient history, forgiven by time if not by paperwork. That belief did not come from nowhere. 3 years ago, Kyle's contracting business collapsed after a bad partnership and a lawsuit that ate most of their savings. I know this, Maisuz, because I did their taxes that year. At Danielle's request, sitting at her kitchen table, going through boxes of unsorted receipts while she apologized for the mess. And Kyle stayed conveniently absent for most of the session. What I found in those boxes told me 2 things. The first was that Kyle's business had failed badly enough that they were 3 months behind on their own mortgage. The second was smaller, and at the time I told myself I'd misread it, because the alternative was something I didn't want to be true about my own sister. The shop's deposit records for that year, which I still had partial access to, because I'd been doing informal bookkeeping for Mom, since her hands got too shaky to manage it herself, didn't fully match the register to tape totals for 3 consecutive months. Not a catastrophic gap. A few $100s here, closer to 1,000 there, the kind of discrepancy that a business owner not paying close attention would write off as register errors or a cash tip miscount. I noticed it because noticing discrepancies is my entire profession. I brought it up with my mother once, carefully, in the gentlest language I had, and she told me. Danielle had started handling more of the day-to-day cash deposits, since her hands got bad, and that I shouldn't worry about it, that family didn't need to audit family. I let it go. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because it's going to come back later with real numbers attached to it, and by the time it does, it won't be a few $100s anymore. That's the shop. Let me tell you about the box, because everyone in that lawyer's office thought they knew what was inside it. And every single one of them was wrong. I didn't open it that night. I want to be honest about that too, because if I make myself out to be someone who cracked the mystery in dramatic fashion, the moment I got home, I'd be lying to you, the same way my family lied to me for years. I set the cedar box on my kitchen counter, made myself dinner, and looked at it for 3 days without touching the latch. Some part of me, I think, already suspected that whatever was inside would change something, and I wasn't ready yet to let it. I'd spent 26 years being the daughter who managed things quietly, who didn't make scenes, who absorbed whatever the family decided was fair and called it peace. Opening that box felt like it was going to cost me that identity, and even though the identity had never once served me, it was the only one I had. On the 4th night, I made a pot of coffee. I had no intention of finishing. Sat down at my kitchen table the way my mother used to sit at hers, and opened the box. The top layer was exactly what Danielle expected it to be, and exactly what she'd laughed about in that conference room. Spools of thread organized by color, a pincushion shaped like a tomato with the felt worn thin, a seam ripper, a folded measuring tape gone soft with age, 3 thimbles, and a stack of pattern papers yellowed at the folds. For a moment, sitting there at midnight with cold coffee, I let myself believe that this really was all it was, a sentimental gesture from a dying woman who wanted her oldest daughter to have a piece of her mother's hands, nothing more, nothing hidden. I actually laughed a little myself, at my own expense, at how much suspicion 26 years in this family had trained into me. Suspicion aimed at a box of thread. Underneath this tray, though, built into the base of the box the way old cedar chests sometimes are, there was a false bottom held down by 2 small brass clips I almost missed in the lamplight. I want to tell you my hands were steady when I found it, because that would fit the story better. But they weren't. I sat there for a full minute with my fingers resting on the clips before I pressed them. What came up when I lifted that panel was not sentimental at all. It was a manila envelope, brittle at the corners, and inside it were 4 things laid flat. And in order, a Miami drama al nostro drama. The way only my grandmother Rose would have arranged them, because I understood almost immediately that this box had not been packed by my mother Trofeur in her final weeks. It had been packed by my grandmother years before either of them got sick and left for my mother to give to me only when the time was right. A time my mother, I would come to learn, had been avoiding for a very long time. The first item was a copy of my own promissory note from 2009, the one I thought only existed in my own file drawer, with Harold Ness's notary stamp in the corner. The second was something I had never seen before in my life. A recorded equitable lien, filed with Donnet, New Hanover County. Register of Deeds in November of 2009, in my name, against the Water Street property, for 35% equity, filed, stamped, real, and never once mentioned to me in 16 years. The third item was a short handwritten letter in my grandmother Rose's unmistakable, slanted hand, dated 4 years before she passed, which I will read to you exactly as when it was written, because I have read it more times now than I can count. It said, "Ellen, your mother will try to protect your sister from the truth of what this shop cost you. I am not willing to protect her from it any longer. What's recorded is recorded. What's owed is owed. Open this when you need to remember that. Grandma rose. And the fourth item was a small spiral notebook. My mother's handwriting this time, not my grandmother's. That I would not fully understand the weight of until 3 weeks later. Sitting across a mediation table from my sister and a forensic accountant hired by an estate attorney, watching numbers I already suspected finally get said out loud in a room where nobody could manage the story anymore. Sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until the sun came up. The 4 documents spread out in front of me like a hand of cards I hadn't known I was holding, and I understood 2 things with total clarity for the first time in my adult life. The first was that my mother had known this entire time exactly what she owed me, on paper, in a county record, in her own dead mother's handwriting. The second was that my sister was already, at that very moment, 3 days into scheduling an appraisal on a house that was, by law, 35% mine. I want to tell you what I did next, because it wasn't rage, and it wasn't a phone call screaming the truth into my sister's ear, the way I'd fantasized about at 2 in the morning. I am an accountant. I know exactly one weapon that has ever worked in my family, and it is not a raised voice. It is a document placed calmly on a table, in front of someone, drama, who cannot be talked around. I picked up my phone and called Grace Doyle's office to make an appointment. And then I did something else. I opened my laptop, pulled up the digitized shop records I still had partial access to, from the years I'd helped Mom with the books, and I started, very quietly, at 4 in the morning, to build a spreadsheet. I titled it, without any particular drama, Rose & Co. Reconciliation. I had no idea yet just how much that single word was going to end up meaning. 1. I gave myself 2 weeks before I said a word to anyone. I want to explain why, because at the time it felt less like patience and more like self-preservation. 26 years of managing conflict in my family had taught me one lesson above every other. The moment you bring an accusation onto my mother's kitchen table without heavy enough to survive her, she turns it around on you. Before you finish the sentence. I had watched her do it to my father over smaller things. I was not going to hand Danielle and Kyle a chance to make this about my grief, my timing, my supposed jealousy of a sister who'd stayed while I left. I needed the numbers first. Numbers don't have a tone of voice. Numbers don't cry at kitchen tables. So I worked. Every night after my own clients' books were closed out, I sat with the shop's digitized records. 3 years of deposit slips, register tapes, QuickBooks file my mother had let me set up for her in 2019. When her handwriting got too shaky to keep a paper ledger anymore, and the little spiral notebook from the sewing box, which turned out to be the single most important document in the entire pile. Here is what that notebook was. My mother, in her own hand, had been tracking something for the last 3 years of her life that she never once brought to me directly. Dates. Dollar amounts. A column with no header, just numbers. Next to a second column that said, in her small cramped writing, register total. The 2 columns almost never matched. I recognized the shape of it immediately, because it was the exact shadow of the discrepancies he said I'd flagged to her 3 years earlier and been told not to worry about. Except my mother had been worrying about it the entire time. She had just never told me she was. I built the spreadsheet slowly, cross-referencing her handwritten numbers against the digital deposit records I still had access to, and by the second week, I had something that made my stomach go cold does. As it softens in the particular way it does as when a client's numbers finally confess what you'd suspected for months. My mother says, over 3 years, the discrepancy between what the register rang up and what actually made it to the bank totaled $61,400. Scene. Not one catastrophic theft. A slow bleed, month after month, small enough to explain away individually, large enough over 3 years to have paid off a mortgage. I want to be precise here because precision is the whole reason anyone should believe a single word of this story. I did not yet know who had taken that money. I want you to sit in that uncertainty with me for a moment, because I sat in it for days. The shop, in its final 3 years, had 4 people with hands in the cash drawer at various points. My mother, who was too sick by the last year to be reliably at the register more than a few hours a week. Danielle, who by then was managing daily operations almost entirely. A part-time seamstress named Connie who'd worked seamstress 11 years, and whom I trusted the way you trust someone, whom I trusted at my mother trust someone who cried harder at my mother's funeral than half our actual family, and, for about 4 months during that window, Kyle, who had started helping out with deliveries and the books and during the worst stretch of his own business collapse. I am an accountant. I do not accuse people on instinct. I built a second spreadsheet. This was one, cross-referencing the specific dates of the discrepancies against the shop's staffing schedule, which my mother, thank God, had also kept. Taped to the inside of a supply cabinet, a habit so old-fashioned and so exactly like her that I actually laughed out loud alone in my kitchen when I found the photo of it on my phone. From a visit 2 years earlier. Of the 11 months where discrepancies appeared, Kyle had been on the schedule for 9 of them. Danielle had been on the schedule for all 11, but so had Connie for 7. And so, faintly, toward the very end, had my mother herself for 4, on days she was well enough to sit at the register for an hour or two, out of what I now understood was stubborn pride, refusing to fully hand her own shop over, even as her body was failing her. I called my mother's old accountant, a man named Phil Granger, who'd done the shop's annual taxes for 15 years and who I trusted the way you trusted anyone who's cashed a decade and a half of checks under scrutiny. Nobody made him submit to. I didn't tell him why I was asking. I told him why I was helping settle the estate and needed his professional reads on 3 years of statements. It took him 4 days to call me back, and when he did, his voice had the particular flatness of a man choosing every word before he said it out loud. Ellen, he said, I noticed some of this 2 years ago. I raised it with your mother directly. She told me she'd handle it internally and asked me not to put anything about it in writing. In my working papers. I sat with that for a long moment before I could make myself ask the next question. Did she say why? She said. Phil told me, and I could hear him deciding how much to soften it before he decided not to soften it at all. That she wasn't ready to lose another daughter. I didn't cry when he said that. I want you to know that, because it would be the easy, expected beat of this story, and it isn't. It isn't what happened. What happened is that I sat very still at my kitchen table for a long time, holding a phone that had already gone to a dial tone. And I understood something about my mother that reframed something about my mother, almost everything else, in this story. She had not simply forgotten what she owed me. She had not simply let Danielle's version of the shop's history win by default, the way I'd assumed. For 16 years. She had known, in real time, that her younger daughter was very possibly stealing from the business was supposed to be my collateral. And she had chosen silence. Not because she didn't care about the truth, but because she was terrified of what naming it would do to the only Auntly family she had left. To the only family onto, my groms Tamainashin while she was Daijnida. She had spent her final years managing 2 daughters' worth of unspoken debt at once. Mine in dollars. Danielle's in whatever it was. Danielle owed the family for years of instability. Nobody wanted to say out loud, and she had solved neither of them. She had simply packed the truth into a cedar box and asked her own dead mother's handwriting to say the thing she couldn't. That is the part of this story I need you to sit with before the confrontation, because it's the reason I don't tell it to you as a clean fight between a good sister and a bad one. My mother was not a villain. She was a woman managing her own fear so badly that her management became its own kind of harm. And Danielle, whatever she had or hadn't taken from that register, had spent 3 years watching her husband's business collapse, her own savings evaporate, and her mother slowly die, while quietly believing, I have come to think genuinely believing, that she was the one holding the family together, the one who'd stayed, the one who'd earned whatever the shop could give her. In a way, the daughter, who left for a bigger paycheck, supposedly hadn't. I don't say that to excuse what the numbers showed. I say it because if I don't tell you both halves of it, you won't understand why the room went the way it did 3 weeks later. I called Grace Doyle first, not Danielle. This matters. Grace was the estate attorney, and my mother's will named her as executor, which meant that legally, before a single asset actually transferred, any competing claim against the estate, like a 16-year-old recorded lien, nobody had disclosed, had to go through her, not around her. I brought her the promissory note, the recorded lien, my grandmother's letter, and my reconciliation spreadsheet, and I watched a woman who reads estate documents for a living go very quiet for almost 2 full minutes. This lien was never released, she said finally, turning the county filing over in her hands like she wanted to check it wasn't a forgery. Which means, as of today, your sister does not have clear title to sell or refinance that property. Not until this is resolved, one way or the other. I'm not trying to take the house from her, I said. And I meant it, though I understand now why nobody in my family would have believed me if I'd said it to their faces. I want what I'm owed. I want to understand what happened to the money in that register. And I want it handled like grown adults, at a table, with someone in the room whose job is to make sure nobody gets to rewrite what happened afterward. Grace looked at me for a long moment. You want a witness, she said. It wasn't a question. I've spent my whole life watching my family manage a story after the fact, I told her. I'm done being managed. She set up a meeting for the following Thursday. Estate mediation, she called it. Though it would end up being a great deal more than that. Her office, a conference table, myself, Danielle, Kyle, and, at Grace's insistence, once I explained the discrepancy in the shop's books, a forensic accountant named Ruth Alvarez that Grace had worked with before on contested estates, a woman whose entire professional reputation rested on the fact that she could not be talked around by anyone's version of events, only their documents. I noted, and did not mention to anyone, that my grandmother's name had also been Rose, and that the accountant who would end up laying the shop's real numbers out on that table shared it spelled differently. Supple, and I let myself believe for exactly one evening that this was some kind of sign before I went back to being the person Sutrep to being the person who trusts spreadsheets more than signs. I texted Danielle the night before. I want to tell you exactly what I sent because I thought carefully about every word. I wrote, I found something in Grandma's sewing box that changes things with the estate. I've asked Grace to set up a meeting Thursday at 10 so we can go through it together properly, with the shop's numbers too. I'm not trying to blindside you.
I'm not Sinji.
I wanted you to have time to prepare. She called me within 4 minutes of reading it. I let it ring twice before I picked up, not for effect, but because I genuinely needed those 2 rings to steady my own breathing. What does that mean changes things, she said. No hello. My sister has never once opened a phone call with a greeting when she's already decided she's under attack, I said. It means Grandma left me more than a sewing box, I said. It means there's a recorded lien on the house from 2009 that nobody ever told me existed, and it means Mom's own records show a discrepancy in the shop's deposits over the last 3 years that I need us to go through, honestly. There was a silence on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. When Danielle spoke again, her voice had changed register entirely, dropped down into something quieter and more frightened than I think either of us expected. You think I stole from Mom, she said. I think, I said, as carefully as I have ever said anything in my life. That $61,000 went somewhere over 3 years, and I think we're going to sit down Thursday and find out. Where, with someone in the room whose entire job is making sure the answer is the true one, and not just whichever one gets said loudest.
You've been planning this.
You've been planning that, Sigis, she said, and I heard something in her voice shift again, toward an anger that I recognized, because it was the exact anger our mother used to wear like a coat. Controlled, cold, absolutely certain of its own righteousness. You waited until Mom was in the ground to go digging for a payout. I waited, I said. Because Grandma packed the proof into a box 4 years before she died, and asked Mom to give it to me when the time was right. And Mom sat on it until she died too, because she was scared of exactly this conversation. I'm not the one who's been planning something, Danny. I'm the one who just found out everyone else already had. She hung up on me. I sat holding the phone for a while afterward, and I want to be honest that some small, tired part of me hoped she'd call back within the hour to apologize, the way we used to as kids after a fight, and that part of me was disappointed, the way, no drama. It has been disappointed by my sister more times than I can count over 52 years. When the phone stayed silent for the rest of the night, Kyle texted instead close to midnight, which told me everything about who was actually steering that household through the crisis. His message read, "This is going to destroy her. You know that, right? Whatever you think you found, is it really worth blowing up what's left of this family over money?" I looked at that message for a long time before I answered it because I recognized the shape of the argument even as it was landing, the same shape my mother used every single time anyone in our family tried to name a debt out loud. Money versus family, framed as though they were 2 separate things that had never once, in this house, been the exact same thing. I wrote back. The money already blew up the family, Kyle. Years ago. I'm just the first one willing to say it out loud in a room where it gets written down. He didn't respond after that. I found out 3 days later from Connie, the seamstress, who'd worked at Rose & Co. for 11 years, and who called me on her own, unprompted. The night before the mediation, her voice shaking in a way that told me she'd been carrying something for a long time and had finally decided the the cost of carrying it further outweighed her loyalty to my sister's paycheck. Secure? Dak. She told me she didn't know anything for certain. She wanted to be clear about that. She wasn't accusing anybody of anything she couldn't prove, but she told me that during the worst stretch of Kyle's business troubles, she'd twice seen him at the register after closing, alone, when he had no reason to be there, doing what he told her was just checking a delivery invoice. And that she'd mentioned it to my mother once, carefully. The way you mention something you're not sure is your business, and my mother had thanked her and told her not to worry about it. I should have said something sooner, Connie told me, Connie Tromer, and I could hear her crying a little on the other end of the line. Your mother was so tired those last 2 years, Ellen. I think she just didn't have anything left to fight with. I thanked her, and I meant it more than she probably knew. Because Connie had just handed me the one thing. A spreadsheet alone can never give you a witness who watched it happen in real time and had nothing to gain, by finally saying so. I wrote her account into a short statement that night, dated it, and added it to the folder I was building for Thursday, next to the promissory note, the recorded lien, my grandmother's letter, my reconciliation spreadsheet, and my mother's own handwritten notebook. 4 columns of numbers that had never balanced and a silence that had cost everyone more than the $61,000 it was hiding. I didn't sleep much the night before the mediation. I sat at my kitchen table with the cedar sewing box open in front of me, running my thumb over the worn felt of my grandmother's old pincushion, and I thought about the version of this story my family was already telling before I'd said a single word in that room. I was the daughter who left. I was the daughter who came back only when there was money to be had. I was, in the story they'd be ready to tell anyone who'd listen, the ungrateful sister trying to take a dying woman's shop away from the one who'd actually stayed and done the work. I thought about my grandmother's letter, sitting in that fake bottom for 4 years before anyone read it, before anyone, waiting with the particular patience of a woman who had learned, in a lifetime of running a business out of her own sunroom, that the truth doesn't need you to defend it loudly. It just needs you to put it on the table and stop apologizing for the fact that it's there. At 9:40 the next morning, I put the folder in my bag, along with the promissory note in its original envelope. And, at the very last minute, almost as an afterthought, I would later be grateful for the cedar sewing box itself, and I drove to Grace Doyle's office to find out, finally, whether 16 years of silence in my family could survive 1 hour at a table with a woman whose entire job was making sure it couldn't. Grace Doyle's conference room faced east. As 10 in the morning the sun came in, low through the blinds, and laid stripes of light across the table, which I remember only because I spent the first several minutes of that meeting staring at them, instead of at my sister, because I could not yet make myself look at her directly. Danielle arrived at 9:58, 2 minutes early, which told me she'd been sitting in the parking lot, working up the nerve to come inside. Kyle came in beside her, and I noticed immediately that he'd worn a suit jacket over a golf shirt, an outfit that struck me as exactly the kind of half-measure my brother-in-law had always specialized in, dressed for a fight he wanted to look serious about, without actually preparing for it. Grace sat at the head of the table. Ruth Alvarez, the forensic accountant, sat to her right with a slim laptop and a folder of her own, and I understood before anyone said a word that she had already done her own pass through the records. Grace had forwarded her, because she had the particular stillness of a person who already knows how a conversation is going to end and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. Grace opened with the plainest possible language, the way I've come to understand. Good estate attorneys always do, because ambiguity is where families find room to keep lying to each other. We're here, she said, because a recorded lien exists as exchange ago water predates Peggy's death by 16 years, was never disclosed during probate, and directly affects both the validity, of the current distribution, and any sale or refinance of that property going forward. We're also snow here, because Ellen has raised a documented discrepancies in the business's deposit records over the last 3 years, which Ms. Alvarez has independently reviewed. I want to be very clear with everyone at this table. My job today is not to referee a family argument. It's to make sure that whatever gets decided here is decided on facts that will hold up, because I promise you, if this ends up in probate court instead of in this room, none of you will like how much slower and more expensive that version is. Danielle's eyes went to me the moment Grace finished, and I want to describe exactly what I saw there, because it wasn't the cold triumph I'd braced myself for. And it wasn't full-blown remorse either. It was something more complicated. Something I recognized. Because I'd felt a version of it myself for 16 years. The specific fear of a person who has built an entire identity on being the one who stayed, the one who was owed, and who is about to watch that identity get measured against a piece of paper it cannot survive. I want to say something before anything else gets shown, Danielle said, and her voice was steadier than I expected. I didn't know about a lien. I swear to you, Ellen, I did not know that existed. If I had known Mom recorded something like that, I would have told you the day she died, whatever else was going on between us. I need you to believe that. I did believe her, actually, and I said so, because it was true, and because I had promised myself, driving over, that whatever else happened in that room, I was not going to let it turn into the kind of fight where nobody says a true thing out of fear it'll be used as a weapon. I believe you, I told her. I don't think you knew about the lien. I think Mom kept that from both of us, for her own reasons, and we're going to have to sit with that separately from everything else. But I need to show you what else was in that box, because some of it isn't about Mom at all. I laid the documents out one at a time, the way Grace had coached me to do the night before, on a call I hadn't told anyone I'd made. Not in a stack, but spread across the table, in sequence, so that nobody could later claim they hadn't had a chance to actually see any single piece before the next one landed. The promissory note first. Kyle's face didn't move much reading it, but Danielle's hand went flat on the table, fingers spreading slightly, the exact gesture our mother used to make when she was teaching cedar something. $85,000, Danielle said quietly. I didn't know it was that much. 11,000 of it got paid back, I said, over 16 years. I'm not telling you this to make you feel like a villain, Danny. I'm telling you because you built a version of that shop's history where I left and you stayed, and that version isn't wrong, exactly. But it's not the whole thing either, and I've spent 16 years watching that half-story get told at every family dinner while my name got quietly edited out of it. I put the recorded lien down next, the county stamp visible, and watched Grace turn it slightly so Kyle could read it too, because I noticed he'd been leaning back in his chair reading everything upside down, and I understood. Watching him do that he had already decided this meeting was primarily a threat to be managed rather than a truth to be reckoned with. This is going to complicate the sale.
This is going to implicate sale.
Kyle said. And it was the first thing he'd said since sitting down. And I noted, the way I note everything now, that his first reaction to a recorded legal claim against his mother-in-law's estate was to talk about the sale. Not about me. Not about my mother, not about any of it. There is no sale currently pending that anyone has legal authority to complete, Grace said, in a tone flat enough that Kyle actually sat up straighter. Not until this is resolved. I put my grandmother's letter down last, before the notebook, because I wanted the room to hear her voice before it heard the numbers, and I read it aloud myself. Instead of letting Grace do it, because it felt wrong to let anyone else's mouth carry my grandmother's words for the first time. Ellen, your mother will try to protect your sister from the truth of what this shop cost you. I am not willing to protect her from it any longer. What's recorded is recorded. What's owed is owed. Open this when you need to remember that. Nobody spoke for a long moment after I finished. Danielle was crying by then. Quietly, the way you cry when you're not trying to perform it for anyone, wiping at her face with the back of her hand in a gesture I recognized from every family funeral we'd ever attended together. She never told me any of this, she said. Grandma never once, in her whole life, said a word to me about a lien. I don't think it was about you, I said, and I meant it. I think it was about Mom. I think Grandma watched her own daughter start rewriting what I was owed within about 2 years of me signing that note, and she didn't trust Mom to ever correct it on her own. So she built her own version of the record and waited. Ruth Alvarez spoke for the first time then, and the entire table's attention swung to her, the ways a room's attention always swings to the person who has been quiet longest, and is finally about to say something. I want to move to the deposit discrepancy, she said. Because I think everyone in this room needs to hear these numbers stated plainly before where this conversation goes any further, and I'd rather do that now than let it sit unspoken while we talk about the house. She opened her laptop and turned it so the screen faced the middle of the table, and I watched Danielle's face while 3 years of numbers appeared in neat rows. Register totals beside deposit totals, beside a running variance column that ended at the bottom in a figure that Ruth read aloud in a voice with no drama in it whatsoever, because drama was never the point. $61,400, unaccounted for across 36 months. I want to be precise about what this data can and can't tell us, Ruth said, before anyone could react. It tells us money that should have reached the bank did not reach the bank. It does not on its own tell us who took it. For that, I cross-referenced the discrepancy dates against the staffing schedule Ellen provided, and I want to walk through what that showed. She pulled up a second screen. I watched Kyle's jaw tighten before she'd said a single further word, and I understood, watching that involuntary flinch happen half a second before the data even loaded, that some part of him had known this exact moment was coming since long before he'd walked in his golf shirt, he'd walked into that room. And suit jacket. Of the 11 months with significant discrepancies, Ruth said, Kyle was scheduled during 9 of them. Danielle was scheduled during all 11, but so was Connie Marsh for 7, and so was Peggy herself, briefly for 4. Staffing overlap alone can't isolate a single actor. But I did one more pass. Because Ellen mentioned that Connie had provided a witness statement, and I wanted to see if the physical timing lined up with it. She looked at her screen for a moment. Connie's statement describes observing Kyle at the register alone, after closing, on 2 specific dates in the fall of that first discrepancy year. Both of those dates show a same-day variance in the register total, each in the range of $400 to $600 sans cents. The room went very quiet. I watched my sister turn her head slowly to look at her husband, and I watched something in her face change in real time. The specific unraveling of a person realizing that the story she has been telling herself about who protects whom in her marriage has just been rewritten in front of witnesses. She cannot manage afterward. I was covering shortfalls, Kyle said, and his voice had gone thin in a way I hadn't heard from him before. The business was going under, Danny. I put money back in more than I ever took out. I swear to God. I was just moving cash around to cover the lease payment some months when the account was short. I never. Do you have records of putting money back in? Ruth asked, not unkindly, but without softening it either, and Kyle didn't answer. And the silence that followed was its own answer. The kind that doesn't need a verdict read into it. Because everyone at the table has already reached the same one on their own. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. Because it wasn't triumph. And I think that surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that day. I felt something closer to grief. A fresh version of the same grief I'd already spent. 18 months caring for my mother, except this time it was for my sister, watching her sit beside a husband who had spent 3 years quietly bleeding her inheritance dry, while she believed. I think honestly believed that she was the one holding their family together through his failure. I thought about what Phil Granger had told me on the phone, that Mom hadn't wanted to lose another daughter. And I understood. Sitting in that conference room with the sunstrump stripes, crawling slowly across the table, that my mother had likely suspected exactly this. Had maybe even known it outright toward the end, and had chosen silence not to protect Danielle from me, but to protect Danielle. Danielle from having to know it about her own husband while she was already burying her mother. Danielle didn't yell. That surprised me too. She sat very still for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice quieter than I'd heard from her in years, "How long?" Danny. How long? Kyle. On and off. Maybe 3 years. It was never. I was going to pay it back once the new contracts came through. I was never trying to. Stop talking, she said. And it wasn't loud, but every person at that table stopped along with him. She turned to me. I need a minute, she said. Not to leave. I'm not walking out on this. I just need a minute before we keep going. Grace called a short recess. I remember standing at the window in the hallway outside the conference room, looking down at the parking lot. Watching a woman I didn't know load groceries into a minivan. Ordinary Thursday morning. Life continuing 3 floors below a room where my entire family's version of itself had just come apart at the seams. Danielle came and stood beside me a few minutes later. Not close, but closer than I expected. I've spent 3 years telling myself I was the strong one, she said, staring out the same window I was. Holding the shop together, holding Mom together at the end. Holding him together, apparently, without even knowing what I was actually holding together for. She let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Mazed. You know the worst part? I resented you the whole time for leaving, for getting to have a clean life somewhere else, while I stayed here managing everyone's mess. And this whole time, you were the one who'd actually paid for the mess to survive in the first place. And I didn't even know it. I don't need you to feel guilty. I told her, and I meant it, though I understood, even as I said it, that guilt was probably not something either of us could fully avoid at this point, hers or mine. I need the lien resolved, honestly. And I need to understand what's actually left in that business before either of us decides what happens to it next. She nodded slowly. and for a moment I saw something in her face that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of a person who has been carrying a story alone for a long time and has just discovered someone else is finally willing to help carry the real one instead. Bansbat. We went back into the conference room 15 minutes later, and what happened over the next hour was not a single clean confession or a single clean apology. And I want to be honest with you about that, because that's not how these things actually resolve, whatever the easier version of this story might have promised you. It was slower than that, and messier, and it left every single person at that table with something they didn't get to walk away with whole. Ruth Alvarez laid out the settlement mechanics first, because that was, in the end, the part that could be resolved with math rather than feeling. Kyle's total documented diversions. Once Ruth finished cross-referencing every discrepancy date against the staffing schedule, and Connie's specific observations came to 48,000 of the 61,000 missing dollars. The rest, Ruth was careful to note, remained genuinely unaccounted for and couldn't be pinned with certainty on any one person, including the 4 months where Peggy had been at the register. No, I want that ambiguity in the record, because tidy stories like to erase it, and this one doesn't get to. Grace laid out the legal path forward in plain terms. My mother's. The recorded lien meant the house couldn't transfer clean title until my 35% interest was either bought out, converted into recorded co-ownership, or otherwise formally resolved. Zophosed. Given the estate's other debts, a reverse mortgage balance on the house that none of us, including Danielle, had fully understood until Grace pulled the payoff figures that morning, a detail that quietly reshaped everyone's assumptions about how much equity was actually sitting in that property to begin with. The realistic options narrowed fast. Mavnos. We agreed, over the next 2 hours, to a structure Grace would draft formally in the following weeks. Danielle would keep the house and the shop, but my equity interest would convert into a recorded promissory obligation repaid over 8 years, structured against the shop's actual revenue rather than a lump sum neither of them could produce. With Ruth Alvarez retained for the first 2 years to independently audit the books quarterly, at Danielle's own insistence, not mine. Kyle agreed, in the same meeting, to a separate personal repayment plan for the diverted funds held apart from the estate matter, entirely, which Danielle made clear afterward, in the hallway. She considered a marriage question now and not a family one. I didn't get everything back that day. And I want to be honest that some part of me had to grieve that too, the version of this story where a single dramatic document made everything whole again. It didn't. What I got was a table full of people who could no longer manage the story, instead of living inside it, and a plan, however imperfect, that put my name back into a history that had spent 16 years quietly editing it out. Danielle. And I had coffee 3 weeks later, just the two of us, at a place near the shop she used to take her lunch breaks at when we were younger. We didn't hug at the end of it. We didn't cry together the way people do in the version of this story that wraps up clean. She told me she was keeping Connie on, giving her a real raise this time, and that she'd started, on her own, sitting down every Sunday night, the way our father used to, going through the register tape line by line before she deposited anything. Faux. Not because anyone was forcing her to anymore, but because she said she didn't ever want to be the kind of person again who didn't notice what was happening in her own house. I told her I still didn't know if I fully trusted her, and she said she didn't expect me to yet. And that felt, strangely, like the most honest thing either of us had said to each other in years. I kept the cedar box. I moved the thread and the pincushion and my grandmother's pattern papers into a drawer. And I left the false bottom empty. Because the documents that used to live there now live in a fireproof folder in a filing cabinet, exactly where an accountant's daughter would put them. But some nights I still open the box just to look at it. At the worn brass clips. At the particular patience of a woman who packed the truth away for 4 years. And trusted that the right daughter would eventually be ready to lift the panel.